The sketch was still wet on my drafting table when my phone buzzed at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. I almost didn't answer. I'd been working late on a pedestrian bridge design for a park renovation in Portland, the kind of small, careful project that most structural engineers wouldn't bother with but that I'd come to prefer over the years, something people would actually stop on, lean over, look at the water below. My coffee had gone cold. The lamp over the table was the only light on in the apartment. I picked up the phone. I answered, but I decided to. She said my name once softly and then, "I need to see you. I know it's late. I know this isn't fair," she paused. "I'm getting married on Saturday, and I can't do it without coming to see you first." I stood there in my dark apartment with a cold cup of coffee and a half-finished bridge on my table, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. "Come," I said finally. She was there in 20 minutes. "My name is James Calloway. I'm 41 years old and I design bridges for a living. Not the famous kind, not suspension cables over bays or cable-stayed spans on interstate highways. I design the smaller ones, footbridges in city parks, pedestrian crossings over light rail tracks, arched wooden walkways over wetland preserves, the kind of structures that engineers with ambition overlook, and that everyone else uses without once thinking about who calculated the load distribution or chose the timber species for the decking. I've been doing it for 15 years out of a 2-room office in Portland, Oregon, with a drafting table I've owned since graduate school and a view of a parking garage across the street. I live alone in an apartment on the east side of the river, 2nd floor, high ceilings, exposed brick on one wall, a kitchen that's too big for one person. After Margot and I divorced, I moved here from the house we'd rented in the Hawthorne neighborhood. The house had a garden she'd spent 3 summers building from nothing, raised beds along the back fence, lavender at the corners, a climbing rose that had finally started taking over the trellis the last year we lived there. I couldn't stay in it after she left. I didn't have the heart to maintain a garden I'd never actually tended. What I kept was a wooden cutting board. She'd bought it at a weekend market on Alberta Street the first fall we were together, a thick end-grain maple block, smooth and heavy, with a small burn mark near one corner from a time I'd set a hot pan directly on it by accident. She'd given me grief about that for a week. I thought about throwing it out after the divorce, the way you think about throwing out everything at first. But it was a good cutting board, and throwing it out felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. So I kept it. I use it every night. Onions, garlic, whatever I'm making for dinner. My hand finds the burn mark sometimes without me looking. Margot and I met at a conference for urban planning and infrastructure in Seattle. I was presenting a paper on load-bearing constraints for pedestrian bridges over tidal zones. She was there representing a nonprofit that built affordable housing in underserved neighborhoods across the Pacific Northwest. She sat in the back of the room during my presentation and came up to me afterward not to talk about bridges, but to ask if I'd ever considered the relationship between pedestrian infrastructure and property values in low-income corridors. I said I thought about it constantly. She looked at me like she was deciding whether to believe that, then said her name, and we talked for 2 hours standing near a window that overlooked Elliott Bay. We got married 16 months later in a small ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge, just family and close friends, on a cliff trail above the water. The marriage lasted 4 years. It didn't end badly. That was almost the hardest part. No betrayal, no discovered secret, single night that broke everything open. Margot wanted to grow, outward, upward in ways that required movement and noise and risk, and a kind of forward momentum I could never quite match. She wanted to run for city council. She wanted to start her own consulting firm. She wanted us to buy a house, expand the garden, host dinner parties that went until 2 in the morning. I wanted to be home by 8. I wanted quiet weekends. I wanted to get better at the work I already did, rather than reach for something larger. We didn't fight about it. We just stopped reaching toward each other. The papers were signed on a gray Wednesday morning in March. She cried once briefly, in the parking lot outside the courthouse. I put my hand on her back and said I was sorry. She shook her head and said, "Don't be, we're just different." And then she walked to her car and I walked to mine, and I drove home and made dinner on the maple cutting board and ate standing at the kitchen counter, and that was that. For 3 years, I heard about Margot the way you hear about people after a divorce. Through mutual friends, through occasional LinkedIn updates, through the particular silence that settles around someone's name when you've both agreed not to talk about them. I knew she'd started her own consulting firm. I knew it was doing well. I knew, through a text from a friend 6 months before that Tuesday night, that she'd gotten engaged to a man named Sterling. I knew who Sterling Vance was. Everyone in Portland's development and civic world did. He was 48, the founder of a real estate development company that had built half the mixed-use towers going up along the waterfront over the past decade. He sat on 3 city boards. His name was on the donor wall of every major arts institution in the city. He was the kind of man who moved through rooms like he owned the square footage. I read the text, set my phone down next to the cutting board, and went back to dinner. If there was something sharp inside my chest, I told myself it was nothing. I was fine. I was always fine. I had my bridges and my coffee and my quiet evenings, and I didn't need anything else. The only person who ever called me on that particular lie was my downstairs neighbor, a 63-year-old retired machinist named Howard who had somehow become my closest friend in Portland. Howard had been married to the same woman for 38 years and claimed this gave him the right to say whatever he wanted about other people's emotional lives. One afternoon when we were both standing in the parking lot and he was looking at the cutting board I'd carried down to scrub off in the utility sink, he squinted at it and said, "You still have that thing?" I said yes. "She picked that out," he said. I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, then went inside without saying anything else. But the look stayed with me, the way a question stays in the body even after the room has gone quiet. So when Margot knocked on my door at midnight in a gray wool coat with her hair down and her eyes looking for something in my face, I felt that question again. Louder, she came in. She stood in the kitchen the way she always used to stand, one hand resting on the counter, weight shifted slightly to one hip, like she was deciding something. She looked around the apartment slowly. Her eyes moved over the drafting table, the lamp, the window. Then they landed on the cutting board. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. She told me about the wedding Saturday, a venue outside of Portland in the wine country south of town, 200 guests. Sterling had arranged everything. The florist, the caterer, the photographer, a string quartet from a conservatory in Seattle. She said all of it the way someone reads from a list, accurately, completely, without warmth. Then she asked me if I still had the lemon cake recipe. I looked at her. "What? The one you made my first birthday after we moved in together. You spent the whole afternoon on it." I said I still had it. She said, "Could you make it?" Looking back, I understand what she was really doing. She wasn't asking for cake. She was testing whether the kitchen still felt the same, whether I still cooked the way I used to, whether the apartment still had the particular quiet she'd once described as the most peaceful place she'd ever been, and then, later, as suffocating. She was standing at the edge of something and trying to read the depth of it before she jumped. But that night, watching her sit down on a stool at the kitchen counter like she'd never left, I thought she just needed to feel something familiar before Saturday. I thought we both could use it. I said okay and started pulling things out of the refrigerator. It was unsettling how fast the rhythms came back. Margot knew my kitchen the way people know their childhood homes, not consciously, but in the body. She opened the cabinet to the left of the stove for the mixing bowls without pausing. She pulled the zester from the drawer beside the sink, the one with the sliding tray that sticks slightly if you don't lift it at the right angle. Her hands knew the trick before I could say anything. She zested 3 lemons while I measured flour. Neither of us talked much, but the silence had texture, the same worn, lived-in texture it had always had in here, not empty, full of the accumulated weight of 1,000 evenings that no longer existed. She laughed when I reached for the measuring cup with my left hand and knocked it off the counter. "Same hand, same mistake, same measuring cup. You've never changed that," she said, and her voice was light but something else moved under it, something I didn't try to name. We put the cake in the oven and sat at the counter while it baked. Over the next hour, Margot talked about her life with Sterling, but there was a gap between her words and her face that I couldn't ignore. "The house was beautiful," she said. Sterling had had it designed by an architect whose name I recognized, 1,200 square feet of kitchen, alone, views of Mount Hood on clear days. But she talked about the house the way someone talks about a hotel, with appreciation and a certain careful distance. She kept reaching for the word we and arriving at he instead. He hired a personal chef for weekday dinners because she worked late. He'd enrolled them in a wine club she hadn't asked to join. He'd suggested, gently but persistently, that she put her consulting firm on pause for the first year of marriage so she could settle into the house. She said the phrase settle into the house the same way you'd say settle into a cage, not bitterly, but with a precision that meant she'd turned it over in her mind many times. Halfway through that hour, her phone lit up on the counter. Sterling's name on the screen. She looked at it. Then she turned it face down. Her hand stayed on it for a moment, pressing it flat against the marble, before she looked back at me and said, "He just wants to know where I am." I didn't say anything, but the air in the kitchen changed, the way the air changes before a storm, not in temperature but in pressure. When the cake was done and cooled, Margot sliced it. We ate standing at the counter with forks and no plates, the way we used to eat everything during the first year we were together. She said it tasted exactly the same. I said the recipe hadn't changed. She said, "Some things don't," and looked at me directly for a moment, and then looked down at her fork. I walked her to the door after midnight. She stopped on her way out and looked back at the kitchen. A long, slow look, the kind where you're not seeing the room but storing it. Then she saw the cutting board on the counter and went still. She said, "I always wondered if you'd get rid of that." "It's a good cutting board," I said. She nodded, like that was exactly the answer she'd expected and was not sure what to do with. She said good night and thank you and went down the stairs. The next morning, she texted to ask what brand of vanilla I used in the cake. I told her. The day after, she asked if I remembered where I'd originally found the recipe. I told her I'd adapted it from something my grandmother used to make. 3 days after that, she showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with a small potted herb, rosemary, in a terracotta pot. The kind she'd always kept on the kitchen windowsill when we were married. She said she'd bought 2 at the farmer's market and didn't have room for both of them. She said it with a straight face. I let her in. Over the following 3 weeks, Margot came back to my apartment 6 more times. The excuses were various and entirely transparent. She had extra soup she'd made too much of. She was in the neighborhood for a client meeting. She wanted to borrow a specific brand of olive oil she claimed she couldn't find at her grocery store. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. An hour became 90 minutes, became 2.5 hours, became an evening that ended at 10. Howard noticed before I did. He cornered me in the hallway one afternoon coming back from the hardware store and looked at the rosemary plant visible through my open door and then looked at me. He said, "James, she's engaged to another man." I told him Margot and I were just maintaining a friendship. He stared at me for 4 seconds without blinking. Then he went back to his apartment. Then Sterling showed up. It was a Wednesday evening. Margot and I were in the kitchen making dinner. A simple roasted chicken, vegetables from the farmer's market she'd brought over. She was talking about a housing project her firm had just landed, a mixed-income development in North Portland, and I was listening to her the way I hadn't listened to anyone talk in years, with full attention, with interest, with the particular pleasure of hearing someone speak about work they genuinely love. The rosemary plant was on the windowsill. The kitchen smelled like thyme and garlic. The front door opened, no knock, no buzzer. Sterling walked in the way he walked into everything, like the space was already his, and arrival was just a formality. He was tall, well-dressed in the specific way that signals money without trying to, dark jacket over a collared shirt, the kind of posture that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in every room he entered. He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen, took in the scene, the 2 of us, the dinner, the wine on the counter, the rosemary on this, smiled. It was the wrong kind of smile. Not anger, not jealousy. Something cooler and more calculated. The expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion and is deciding what to do with that information. He came forward and shook my hand. His grip was firm and held a beat too long. "James," he said, "Margot talks about you." His voice was warm and there was nothing warm inside it. He pulled a stool from the counter and sat down without being invited, positioned directly between Margot and me. He began talking about the wedding venue, the weekend weather forecast, the rehearsal dinner reservation at a restaurant downtown. He described each detail with the calm authority of someone making business decisions. Then, without changing his tone at all, he turned to Margot and said, "You told him about the firm, right?" Margot went still. Sterling looked at me pleasantly. He explained that they'd made a joint decision. He said joint with a particular steadiness that told me exactly whose decision. It to fold Margot's consulting firm into his development company after the wedding. Simplified the finances. Easier for tax purposes. She'd essentially be leading the community impact division of his operation. Same work, he said, just under his umbrella. I looked at Margot. She was looking at the cutting board on the counter. Her jaw was set. Her hands were in her lap. Sterling stood, adjusted his jacket, and placed one hand on my shoulder briefly with weight. "Nothing personal," he said. "I just like knowing where my people are." He said it pleasantly, and then he turned and walked out of my apartment, and the door closed behind him with a soft, precise click. The silence after he left was not the silence. Margot and I had spent 3 weeks sitting inside comfortably. This silence had edges. It pressed. Margot didn't cry right away. She sat looking at the counter for a long moment. Then she picked up her wine glass and set it back down without drinking from it. She said quietly, "I was going to tell you about the firm." I said, "What happened to it being yours?" She didn't answer. I asked her carefully what the last 3 weeks had been, what the cake and the rosemary and the evenings in my kitchen had meant. She stood up. She picked up her coat from the chair. She started toward the door but stopped in the kitchen, and her hand came to rest on the cutting board, flat, both palms, pressing against the maple like she was steadying herself against it. Her head was down. When she finally spoke, her voice was fractured at the edges. She said, "Do you want to know why I really came here that first night?" I said yes. She said, "Because I needed to know if you still had this." She lifted one hand and placed it flat against the burn mark near the corner. I told myself, if the cutting board is still on that counter, if he kept it, if it's just sitting there like it always was, then I know, I'm making a mistake. She picked up her bag and walked out. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The chicken was still in the oven. The rosemary was on the sill. The cutting board was on the counter where it had been every evening for 3 years, with its burn mark and its smooth maple grain and the particular weight of everything I hadn't been willing to let go of. In the days that followed, I started to understand the full shape of what I'd been watching. Sterling hadn't announced the merger of Margot's firm to be practical. He'd done it because he'd been watching too, watching Margot become someone he couldn't fully account for when she was in my kitchen. He'd come to my apartment not out of jealousy but out of ownership. He hadn't been checking on her. He'd been filing a claim. I talked to Howard. I told him most of it, the firm, the way Sterling had walked in, the hand on my shoulder. Howard listened without expression until I was done. Then he said, "That man doesn't love her, he's organizing her." I didn't sleep well for several days. On Thursday, I drove past the building where Margot's consulting firm had its office, a small suite on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District. I'd been there once, to help her move in. Her name was on the door in small bronze letters. I don't know what I expected to feel driving past. Something settled in my chest that wasn't sadness. Closer to clarity, I went to see her. She was at her office alone, packing boxes. The bronze letters were still on the door, but they were at an angle. Someone had started removing them and stopped. She was surrounded by years of work in cardboard boxes, project files for affordable housing developments across Oregon and Washington, binders and folders, and the particular organized chaos of a person who has spent years building something. She looked up when she heard me in the doorway. She didn't look surprised to see me. The room was practical and stripped and honest in a way that my kitchen hadn't been. No candlelight, no wine, no layers of shared history softening the edges. Just Margot and boxes and the name half removed from the door. I said, "I'm not here to ask you to come back to me. That's not what this is." She waited. "I'm here because you told me something in my kitchen. You said if the cutting board was still there, you'd know you were making a mistake. And I think you already know, Margot. You've known since the first night you came over. So what are you going to do with what you know?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor among the boxes. And she told me everything. Sterling had been careful about the money from the beginning. He'd offered to consolidate their accounts early in the relationship. It was simpler, he'd said. It made sense logistically. And she'd agreed because she trusted him. And because she was tired after years of managing everything alone. But what consolidation had actually meant was that every purchase over a certain amount required his awareness. Not his approval exactly, his awareness. He'd framed it differently, but the effect was the same. Her family was in upstate New York. Her parents, her brother and his wife, 2 nieces she adored. In 2 years with Sterling, she'd been home once. Every other planned visit had been preempted by an event Sterling had scheduled for them both, a trip, a work dinner, a weekend commitment that had always sounded reasonable until you noticed the pattern. Her nieces had stopped asking when she was coming. She'd had 3 close friends when she met Sterling. One by one they'd drifted, not because of any argument, not because of anything dramatic, but because Sterling was always slightly unavailable when she made plans with them, and subtly present, subtly sighing, subtly disappointed, when she came home from seeing them without him. The last one had stopped calling 8 months ago. The thing that broke her voice when she said it was this: he had never once raised his voice at her. He had never been cruel. He had been, by every visible measure, a devoted and generous partner, she said. I can't even explain it to people. There's nothing to point to. Just this feeling of being managed. Of being a project he's improving. She'd canceled 2 prenatal appointments because Sterling had expressed doubt about the OB she'd chosen and suggested she consider a different practice across the city that came more highly recommended, and she didn't have the energy to push back. So she'd rescheduled, and then he'd had thoughts about that practice too, and months had passed, and she wasn't pregnant, but she'd been wanting to get a full check-in with a doctor, and somehow that simple thing had become too complicated to do alone. She said, I'm not afraid of him, James. I'm afraid that I can't find the floor anymore. Like the whole life we've built is his architecture, and I'm just living in it. I sat down on the floor across from her, among the cardboard boxes, in the stripped light of a room that used to hold her name on the door. I said, I kept the cutting board because I wasn't ready to say what keeping it meant. I know that. I've known it for 3 years. I stopped, but I also know that the first step isn't toward me. It's away from him. For you, not for us, not because of what happened in my kitchen. For you. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. Howard had given it to me 2 days earlier, slid it under my door without knocking. A name and a phone number. The attorney who'd handled Howard's daughter's divorce 2 years back. A woman Howard described as the best he'd ever seen in a room that needed holding. I handed it to Margot. She read it, folded it smaller, put it in her coat pocket. We sat on the floor of her half-packed office for a little while longer, and neither of us said anything else, and that was the right amount. Within the week, Margot called the attorney. I know because she texted me after, a single line. Made the call. I didn't respond right away. I put my phone down on the drafting table and stood at the window and looked at the parking garage across the street and felt something very old and very tight loosen slightly in my chest. The wedding did not happen on Saturday. Sterling responded the way men like Sterling respond when the thing they've built begins to resist them. Not with grief, but with leverage. He moved to freeze joint accounts, contacted her firm's landlord about the lease, and made 2 calls to professional contacts of hers that were clearly designed to signal that her reputation was connected to his goodwill. But the attorney Howard had recommended had seen this before. She was not impressed by Sterling Vance's lawyers, and she said so, and she meant it. I made a decision that surprised me in the making of it. I stayed away. Not because I didn't want to see Margot. Because I understood that if she came back to me before she stood on her own ground again, we'd just repeat the same mistake in a different arrangement. She needed to know what her own kitchen felt like. Her own choices, her own schedule, her own name on her own accounts, before we built anything else. So I left groceries at her door on Sunday mornings, whatever looked good at the market. Eggs, good bread, fresh pasta, early season tomatoes when they started appearing. I'd text 2 words, front door, and leave. I didn't knock, I didn't wait in the hallway. I drove home and sat at my drafting table and worked on bridges, and some Sundays I had to sit in my truck for a minute before I could pull away, and then I pulled away. Howard told me, after the 3rd or 4th Sunday, that I was doing the right thing. Then he said, doesn't make it easier though. I said no, it did not. Margot restarted her consulting firm, new name her name only, filed under her own LLC. She sent me a photo of the door of the new office, a small suite in Southeast Portland, just a single room to start. Her name on the glass in white vinyl letters. I stared at that photo for longer than was probably reasonable. She started therapy. She told me this herself, in a text, and added, I should have started years ago. She sent occasional updates, not heavy ones, just small flags of a life being rebuilt. A photo of a bookshelf she'd assembled herself, a message that said simply good week, and then one evening a photo of her kitchen table in the new apartment, a wooden surface, a single plant in a terracotta pot, and a small end-grain maple cutting board in the corner, different from mine, but close. I held my phone in my kitchen for a while, looking at that photo. Then I looked at my own cutting board on the counter, with its burn mark and its history, and I felt something I still can't quite name accurately, just tightness, somewhere between my ribs, that I'd learned over the years to recognize as meaning something mattered. Sterling's professional reckoning came from a direction no one had predicted. A city audit of Conch in the past 5 years flagged 3 of his development projects for bid irregularities. Federal investigators followed the audit. By spring, there were sealed filings and a lawyer who was no longer returning calls and a profile in the Oregonian that Sterling's PR team could not get ahead of. The details were technical: shell companies, falsified environmental compliance documents, a state housing grant routed through a subsidiary he'd never disclosed. But the outcome was not. Margot's attorney moved quickly. The settlement was clean. Margot walked away with her firm, her finances, her name, legally, finally, completely free. In April, she came back to my kitchen. She arrived in the early evening in jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back, carrying nothing more than a small paper bag from the grocery store. She'd bought lemons. She stood at the door and held them up and said, "I thought we could make the cake." I stepped back and let her in. Everything was different this time, and everything was the same. The difference was something in her posture, open, unhurried, unguarded in a way that the woman who'd knocked on my door at midnight had not quite been. She moved through my kitchen without that trace of inventory taking, without the quiet calculation I'd felt in her in October. She was just here, present, not checking whether the room still held what she remembered, because she wasn't looking for a sign anymore. She was just making a cake. We talked the whole time easily, without the carefully modulated language of the first night, or the charged silence of the evenings in between. She told me about her new office, about the 2 associates she'd just hired, about a housing project in Gresham that had hit a snag over zoning variances. She told me about her therapist, a woman she described as the most direct human being I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest compliment. She told me about calling her nieces and talking to them for an hour, and crying afterward, not from sadness, but because they still knew her voice. When the cake went into the oven, she sat on the counter the way she used to, and I leaned against the opposite counter, and she looked at me steadily and said, "How are you, James?" "Actually," I said, "better lately." She nodded. "Me too." After dinner, standing at the sink washing up, our shoulders close but not quite touching, she said, without looking at me, "You know what Sterling's kitchen had that mine didn't?" I said, "What?" "An answer for everything. Every drawer labeled, everything in its place. I lived there 2 years and I never once had to figure out where anything was, because he'd already decided." She passed me a bowl to dry. I didn't know how much I missed not knowing until I moved into my own place and had to put everything somewhere myself. And I thought, oh, this is what it feels like when the choices are yours. I put the bowl away. She passed me the cutting board. Rinsed. I took it from her hands, and for a moment we were both holding it, and neither of us let go right away. The burn mark was visible on her side. She looked at it. Then she let go, and I set it back on the counter in its place. We moved to the couch, wine on the coffee table. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland does in April. Soft rain against the windows, the city lights blurred and doubled in the water on the glass. We talked about her nieces, about a documentary she'd watched 3 times, about a footbridge I was designing for a wetlands trail in Astoria that I was more proud of than anything I'd built in years. Small things, true things. The kind of conversation that doesn't announce its own importance. At some point she said, "I came back to your kitchen in October because I needed a sign. I needed the cutting board to still be there so I could have permission to trust what I already felt." She paused. "I don't need a sign anymore," she said. I looked at her. She said, "I just want to be here because I want to be here. Is that enough?" I said yes, and I meant it in a way that felt clean and straightforward and earned, the way the best structures feel, not in spite of everything they've had to carry, but because of it. She didn't move in right away. That came gradually, the way the good things do. A drawer that became hers, a shelf in the bathroom, the rosemary plant migrating permanently from her windowsill to mine, a key made without ceremony on a Tuesday in June. Howard approved. He said so in his own way, by starting to set 3 coffee cups out when I came downstairs on Sunday mornings instead of 2. Margot's firm grew. By the following year she had 4 employees and 2 projects in development. One of them a collaboration with the city's housing bureau, the kind of work she'd been reaching toward when we first met. Her name was on the door, her name was on the contracts, her choices were in every decision. There's a framed sketch on the wall of my office now, a preliminary drawing of the Astoria footbridge. Margot framed it without asking me, because she knew I never would have framed it myself. She put it up one Saturday while I was at a job site. I came home and stood in front of it for a long time. The cutting board is still on the counter. Both of ours are. Now because Margot found one at the Alberta Tree Market that first fall we were back together, same end grain maple construction, slightly lighter in color, without a burn mark. Hers sits beside mine. Two boards, different ages, the same material, side by side on the counter where we cook dinner most evenings now. Some mornings I pour coffee and stand at the counter and just look at them for a moment before I do anything else. I don't know if I'm looking at the burn mark or the absence of one on hers. I think I'm just looking at the fact of them together and being grateful that I never threw mine away. Not because I was smart enough to know it mattered, but because I wasn't ready to say goodbye to something that still did. Have you ever held on to something you couldn't explain? A burned pot holder, a cracked mug, a book someone gave you that you'll never read again, and known, without being able to say it clearly, that you were really holding on to a person. And if the right person knocked on your door tonight, would you know what you were holding? Drop a comment and tell me what your cutting board is. I read every single one. See you in the next story.